Let's be real here. Say it, dig it, and analyze it. That's Deep Story. Thanks for tuning into Deep Story. I'm MPT. So, not long ago, MPT tagged along with 17 of our Deep Story members for a little getaway to Fiji, this idyllic South Pacific island nation. Oh, and we even shot an episode there. But here's the kicker: as soon as we landed back home and checked our phones, we learned something pretty interesting. Turns out, Fiji only gained independence from the British Commonwealth a little over a decade ago. Yep, they literally peeled the Union Jack off their flag. And not too long ago, they even gave Queen Elizabeth the boot, took her face off their banknotes. I mean, talk about a breakup. Huh? So naturally, we were curious. What happened? We asked our local tour guide. The guide casually said, "Oh, we had a coup. Our commander in chief kicked out the prime minister. The Commonwealth got mad at us, so we stopped playing with them and became independent." Well, okay then. At that moment, we felt a little nervous. I mean, it had been less than 2 years since this coup. Is it safe to travel here? The guide waved us off like we were overreacting. "No worries, nothing happens here." "Oh, nothing happens? What do you mean by coup exactly?" he said. "The commander in chief just calls the prime minister and goes, 'Hey bro, time to pack your bags. 3 days, move out.' The prime minister shrugs and goes, 'Fine, I'll leave.' And the commander just moves in. Simple as that. Meanwhile, the locals are chilling at the village square like, 'Did you hear? There's been a coup.' 'Oh yeah, cool, but..." And they just go back to living their peaceful lives. So while we were in Fiji, we couldn't help but notice how relaxed people were about words like sovereignty, transition, independence, coup. These are words that, in most countries, would make people straighten their backs and clutch their pearls. But in Fiji, it's just Tuesday. It's like these grand political changes have zero impact on the average person's life. That's when we got the idea: why not do an episode about the history of the British Empire, the predecessor to today's Commonwealth? Now, listen to the name, the British Empire. Doesn't that sound massive, powerful, kind of aggressive, even? But was it really built on that kind of logic? To find out, we've got to dig into the past. So, what exactly is the British Empire? Well, strictly speaking, it didn't really exist until 1877. Why? Because that's the year Queen Victoria proclaimed herself Empress of India. Before that, she was just a queen. So technically, the British Empire wasn't an empire in name until then. There's a great book I want to mention: Empire: How Britain Made the Modern World by Niall Ferguson, a well-known British historian. Ferguson argues that the story of the British Empire is basically Winston Churchill's life story. Churchill was born in 1874, right as the empire was entering its peak. By the time he passed away in January 1965, he'd seen it all: the rise, the glory days, and the collapse. Talk about front row seats to history. I mean, the man literally watched the empire fade into the sunset. 1965 was essentially the British Empire's funeral. But that's just a historical definition. If we want to talk about the logic behind this empire, we need to rewind a whole century earlier. So let's do the math: 100 years before 1877. That takes us to 1777. And what was happening around then? Oh, just the American Revolutionary War. Remember 1776? Lexington, the shot heard round the world: America declares independence. So here's the twist. The British Empire that we all think of, that global powerhouse, actually rose from the ashes of Britain's defeat in the American Revolutionary War. I mean, think about it, it's kind of tragic. The British had spent hundreds of years fighting Spain, the Netherlands, and France, carving out this massive colony across the Atlantic. And then, boom, America up and leaves. Like a 40 something year old guy suddenly getting divorced. Picture MPT here, house gone, land gone, wife and kids gone, just standing there staring into the void. That was Britain after losing America. And oh, how the rest of Europe laughed. Joseph T. of Austria snickered, "The Brits are done. Second rate country now. We don't play with them anymore." Even King George back in Britain was so humiliated. He probably wanted to quit on the spot just to save face. It was that bad. But here's the weird thing about this so called defeat. I don't know if you've noticed, but when you read about the American Revolutionary War, whether it's written by Americans or Brits, it just feels off. The narrative always goes something like this: "Oh, Washington was such a virtuous leader. The citizens were starving unpaid and dressed in rags, yet they still rallied behind him. Look, if you're telling a good revolution story, it's gotta have two parts first. Climbing snowy mountains and crossing deadly swamps. Second, epic battles where you smash Napoleon's teeth into the dirt, right? But America's independence? Nope, you don't hear stories of how the British had some overwhelming advantage, got worn down through brutal battles, and then lost due to Washington's genius strategy. No, the war feels incomplete. So, what's the real logic behind this? You can't understand it through the lens of mortal enemies because, at the end of the day, Britain and America were family father and son, brothers from the same bloodline. When the British finally pulled out, when they essentially threw in the towel at Yorktown in 1781, where their entire army surrendered and signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, they had one simple thought: this isn't worth it. I'm done playing this game. That's the truth. The British attitude was like, my son doesn't listen, huh? Should I keep fighting him? Even if I win, what do I really gain? They did the math, shrugged, and said, "Oh, fine, let him go. The kid's all grown up anyway. Rain's gonna fall, daughters are gonna marry, let him be." That, my friends, is what I ultimately took away after reading the history. The Brits didn't lose because they were weak. They just decided the whole ordeal wasn't worth it. Let's break it down with some cold, hard numbers. Before the Revolutionary War, Britain had just finished the 7 Years' War with France. You know how much that war cost them? £1.2 billion. That doesn't sound like much today, enough to build, what, a mid-tier sports stadium. But back then, it was an astronomical sum. And here's the kicker: after that war, Britain stationed 10,000 troops in America for defense purposes, to keep an eye on the colonies and fend off Native American attacks. Those 10,000 troops cost £350,000 per year. Now let's talk about tax revenue. You know how much Britain was getting annually from the colonies? £110,000. So let's get this straight. They were spending £350,000 to protect a colony that only paid £110,000 in taxes. And every now and then, a war like the 7 Years' War would roll around, costing them billions again. At some point, the British were like, "Are we stupid? Why are we doing this?" From a purely financial perspective, walking away made perfect sense. But wait, we all know the classic territorial logic. right? Not 1 inch of land, not one rock can be spared. That's the politician's mantra. A leader has to answer to future generations, protect every speck of soil. So, why didn't the British think this way? Eh, well, this brings us to a man we've mentioned many times in our show, the author of The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith. And what an incredible coincidence this was. When did America declare independence? 1776. And when did Smith publish The Wealth of Nations? Also 1776. Two historical events crashing into each other at the exact same time. Niall Ferguson, the author of Empire, once joked about this at a tea talk. He said, in 1776, a British gentleman wrote a very important book. Oh, and there was also this tiny little incident where a colony tried to declare independence. Oh, the American audience burst into laughter because they got the joke. And there's something fascinating hidden in that humor. Which event was actually more important? Ferguson argues it's the wealth of nations. Why? Because the ideas in that book convinced the British to change their worldview. What ideas? You ask. In The Wealth of Nations, specifically Book 2, Chapter 7, Adam Smith spelled it out for the Brits. Let the colonies go. If they want independence, let them have it. Why? Simple. First, the financial burden disappears. No more bleeding money on military expenses. Second, a free trade economy can thrive. Why monopolize trade with colonies when you can just trade freely? Monopolies only benefit merchants with royal charters, not the average person. And once you pull out, the math becomes simpler, you'll save money. Trade will flow naturally, and because you share the same language, laws, and family ties, relations will heal. Heck, if Britain ever gets into trouble in the future, little brother America might even come to the rescue. And you know what? Smith was right. Fast forward to the 20th century, who bailed Britain out during World War I and World War II. That's right, the United States. Adam Smith called it almost 150 years earlier, so the British didn't lose America because they were weak. They lost it because they were smart. This is essentially what Adam Smith was preaching at the time. Now, of course, it wasn't like some university professor's ideas immediately convinced an entire nation overnight. The real magic was that a group of sharp British politicians actually got it. And one of the most interesting political figures in British history, a guy named William Pitt the Younger, who became Prime Minister in 1783. Pitt the Younger was a legend. First of all, his age. This guy became Prime Minister at just 24 years old. 24. The king had to fight off a lot of skepticism to put this baby faced kid in charge of the entire country. But guess what? He stayed at the helm for the next 20 years. And it was during these 20 years that the British Empire rose, phoenix, like from the ashes of its American defeat. And guess what? Pitt was a total fanboy of Adam Smith. There's this famous story that perfectly illustrates this. One day, Pitt was meeting with a room full of senior politicians when suddenly Adam Smith walked in. Boom! Everyone stood up. Smith, awkward and modest, said, "Gentlemen, please, there's no need for that." The Pitt shot back, "No, sir, you sit first." This whole scene, it's straight out of classical history. It's like Caesar honoring Cicero, you sit first because every man in this room is your student. And this tiny little moment reveals two important things. First, Adam Smith's ideas had immense persuasive power. They completely convinced Britain's political elite at the time. Second, there was this aha moment for these politicians, a real clouds parting, sunlight streaming kind of realization. Otherwise, why would they hold Smith in such reverence? His ideas weren't obvious until he came along. So, what were these revolutionary ideas? Well, we've touched on this in previous episodes. At its core, it's simpler while everyone acts out of self interest. As long as there's division of labor and free trade, everyone wins. Everyone benefits from the pie getting bigger rather than fighting to split the existing pie. Once you understand that, the whole issue of colonies makes perfect sense. Don't own the colony, just use it. Maintain trade with your brothers and cousins through shared bloodlines, culture, and business. Let them be independent, and trade will generate new wealth that benefits everyone. This was the logic that Adam Smith laid out so brilliantly. Fast forward 100 years to the late 19th century. By then, all the European powers were flexing their muscles, rushing out of Europe like it was a Black Friday sale, grabbing colonies as fast as they could. But the British mindset was fundamentally different because Smith's ideas had already taken root. Meanwhile, the other nations were late to the party, so they were driven by a frenzied, almost militaristic competition. They raced to snatch colonies without even stopping to ask, is this a good deal? Eh, as Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm later put it, the numbers don't add up. Most of these colonial ventures didn't even break even. Now, we don't have Hobsbawm's exact spreadsheets to double check, but the logic is pretty clear. Imagine this, you're suddenly transported 150 years back in time. Someone hands you a colony and says, congratulations, you're the governor. Great, right? Wrong. Because what are you in charge of? Poverty. That's what. Whether it's in Asia, Africa, wherever, there's not much wealth to squeeze out. But here's the kicker to maintain control over this colony. You've got to station troops, build forts, pay for infrastructure. Armies cost money. Soldiers need food and salaries. So the wealth you're extracting from the locals, it doesn't necessarily cover your costs. It's not guaranteed to be profitable. See, people think, oh, I've got the bigger fist. I'm the boss here. I'll just take what I want. But power doesn't automatically mean profit. Colonies, they weren't always a great business deal. The British figured this out early because Adam Smith showed them the math. The rest of Europe, they were out there fighting to win, but a lot of them were just bleeding money. So back in 1904, a German magazine published a political cartoon that really captured how differently each colonial power approached their colonies. The Germans, oh, they were the cruel followers. They'd bring in crocodiles, giraffes, whatever it took to set up colonies that reflected their strict German order. Everything had to follow the system. The French, on the other hand, well, they were a little more free spirited. Their colonies often looked like chaotic parties, local tribes thrown together with no rhyme or reason. And then there were the Belgians. Take their colony in the Congo, for example. King Leopold didn't bother with niceties. His policy was simple. I'm here to exploit you. He squeezed the locals like juice out of a lemon, cutting metaphorical, and sometimes literal, chunks of the population until there was nothing left. But British colonies, oh, they were a different story. The Brits had a knack for turning local people into merchants. They built up a class of local traders and then, surprise, did business with them. Of course, the Germans couldn't resist mocking this. So the cartoon showed British soldiers rolling locals into human rolling pins, squeezing out every last penny. And when the locals were completely broke, no problem. The British sent in missionaries. Go on, find comfort in your soul, my child. Even in this German satire, though you can sense the underlying truth, the British approach was the smartest. And that brings us to the main point here. What was the British Empire? Don't think of it like the Mongol Empire, where Genghis Khan used swords, horses, and sheer bloodshed to conquer every inch of land. Sure, the British also used guns and violence. But if you look closely at the British Empire, especially during the Victorian era, it was something else entirely. It was more like an ecosystem. It grew naturally. Its dominance had far less bloodshed than people might assume. And this complexity is why, even today, most people can't untangle what's what. What's England? What's Great Britain? What's the British Empire? And those long winded titles the British monarchs carry, what do they even mean? It's all a mess because the colonies themselves were so varied. Some were dominions with full autonomy, others were semi autonomous. Some were mandates or protectorates, essentially wards of the crown. Take India, for example. It wasn't one unified colony, it was a patchwork quilt. There were directly governed provinces under the British Crown and hundreds of princely states that were semi autonomous. Each one operated differently. Or look at America. When the United States declared independence, there were 13 colonies, but those colonies weren't all the same. Massachusetts, that was the Puritan colony founded by the Mayflower Pilgrims. And here's where Adam Smith's genius comes back into play. Colonies weren't about owning them, they were about using them. The British realized early on that brotherly ties, shared language, blood, and business were far more profitable than hoarding territories. The goal wasn't to fight over existing wealth, but to grow the pie through trade. That's why, by the late 19th century, when the other European powers were flexing their muscles and racing to claim colonies like they were running a military marathon, the British stood apart. Their colonial strategy was already in place by Adam Smith's time, the other nations. They were late to the game, so their approach was frantic, a scramble driven by rivalry and competition. And as Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm put it, if you do the math, most of those colonies weren't worth it. The costs outweighed the profits. Now, Hobsbawm didn't leave us with a tidy balance sheet, but the logic makes sense. Imagine this, you're sent back 150 years and handed a colony to govern. Sounds exciting, right? But wait, what are you governing? Poverty. You're squeezing a population that has almost nothing to give. And to maintain control, you need troops. You need infrastructure, you need money. So, let's be real. The wealth you extract probably won't even cover your costs. Colonies were expensive. Just because you had the bigger fist didn't mean you made a bigger profit. The British figured this out early, thanks to Adam Smith, the rest of Europe. They were out there fighting, spending, and bleeding money, thinking they'd won when in reality they'd signed up for the worst business deal of their lives. So here's the thing, even though we don't have the exact receipts to crunch the numbers, it's clear there was a major issue with colonial profitability. Imagine this, you get magically transported back 150 years and someone hands you a colony. Congratulations, you're the governor now. Sounds great, right? Except everyone's poor. Whether you're in Asia or Africa, there's not much wealth to squeeze out. But in order to control the people, you've got to station troops. And guess what? Troops need food, salaries, and equipment. So, is it really worth it? Just because you're the big boss with the bigger fist doesn't mean you're automatically rolling in profits. Colonies weren't always a gold mine, they were often just a money pit. Which brings us to this 1904 German cartoon I mentioned earlier. It perfectly captured how different countries approached their colonies. The Germans, well, they were all about order. Rules are rules. They'd haul in crocodiles, giraffes, and whatever else they needed to recreate German precision overseas. The French, far more relaxed, free, spirited even. Their colonies often turned into a chaotic jumble of local tribes and French creativity. Now, the Belgians. That was a whole different story, especially in the Congo. King Leopold didn't even pretend to play nice. His attitude was, I'm here to squeeze you dry, no questions asked. He took exploitation to a grotesque extreme. And then there were the British. Oh, the Brits had a style of their own. They developed local people into merchants and then surprise do business with them. Of course, the Germans couldn't resist poking fun at this, so the cartoon showed British soldiers rolling local merchants like dough, flattening them to extract the very last penny. And when those merchants were completely broke, no problem. The Brits sent in missionaries. Your pockets are empty. Here, let's save your soul instead. But even within this mockery, you can see something interesting. The British approach was probably the smartest. Which brings us to the point of the day. What exactly was the British Empire? Don't think of it like Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire, where land was conquered inch by inch with swords, horses, and rivers of blood. Sure, the British used guns, knives, and violence too, but when you really look at the British Empire, particularly during the Victorian era, it wasn't one giant, unified system. It was more like an ecosystem that grew naturally. The violence was far less pronounced than you might think. And that's why, even today, unless you're a hardcore history buff, it's nearly impossible to untangle what's what. What's England? What's Great Britain? What's the British Empire? Why does the British monarch carry 10,000 titles? The answer lies in the messy patchwork of its colonies. Some were dominions with full autonomy. Others were semi autonomous territories. Some were protectorates, essentially wards of the crown. Take India, for example. India wasn't one big colony, it was a collection of regions. Some territories were directly controlled by the British Crown, while others were princely states with local rulers who had varying degrees of autonomy. Or take the United States, where the 13 colonies that declared independence were all different in origin. Massachusetts. That was the Puritan colony, founded by the Pilgrims on the Mayflower when they landed at Plymouth. Virginia. That started as a royal charter, a business venture, essentially run by a company that later went bankrupt, so the British Crown had to step in. North Carolina. That was a royal colony from the start, established with direct oversight from the king. And then there's Rhode Island, founded by a group of rebels from Massachusetts who didn't like being told what to do, so they packed up and started their own colony. You see the pattern. The British didn't design this system, it just grew organically. That's why the British Empire wasn't a monolithic empire like the Mongols or Romans. It was a mishmash of territories, each with its own story. And this brings me to something funny I noticed as a kid. Have you ever looked at a world map and thought, what the heck is Lesotho? Lesotho, that tiny country surrounded entirely by South Africa. It's like a little circle in the middle of the map. When I was younger, I thought, how did that even happen? Did someone lose a bet? But once you understand the British Empire's history, it all makes sense. Lesotho is what happens when you patch territories together. Back in the day, when South Africa's colonies were combining to form a federation, Lesotho simply said, nope, not interested. We'll stay independent. Thank you very much. And the British were like, fine, you do you. So South Africa became a unified federation, and Lesotho ended up as this tiny enclave right in the middle. But here's the kicker, it wasn't a problem. There was no war, no drama. Lesotho stayed where it was, surrounded by South Africa, and everyone just kept doing business, living their lives, and getting along. Compare that to Asia, where if a similar situation had happened, the whole region might have exploded in chaos. That's the fascinating thing about the British Empire. It didn't conquer and control in the way we usually imagine. It wasn't a single empire, it was a loose, sprawling, messy ecosystem that somehow worked. Let's break this down. When you look at Canada, Australia, and India today, you have to understand they didn't emerge as perfectly planned nations. They grew piece by piece like a patchwork quilt stitched together over time. Back then, the Germans and other European powers would mock the British for this. The Germans scoffed. Your empire looks like it's held together with duct tape and patches, the one good punch, and it'll all fall apart. Well, then came World War One. Then came World War Two. Who fell apart? Germany. And that patched up, seemingly disorganized British Empire, it held firm all the way until Churchill's final days. Why? Because guys like Adam Smith and Edmund Burke had already laid out the blueprint. Their logic was crystal clear. If ruling doesn't work, the emotional ties remain, and if the emotional ties break, the trade relationships will keep things going. That was the foundation of the British system. Think about this. When the British Empire officially collapsed, it didn't just vanish, it rebranded itself as the Commonwealth. What's the Commonwealth? It's a club. You keep the Union Jack in a corner of the flag, everyone pretends to recognize the British monarchy, and life goes on. Every few years, they even host the Commonwealth Games like the Olympics, but with more tea and politeness. The Queen or King pops out, waves to the crowd, and everyone's happy. But don't mistake this for a weak connection. That emotional bond is surprisingly strong. Take World War II. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand all sent their best troops to fight for Britain. Think about it. Why on earth would a New Zealander fight in Europe? The Germans weren't invading New Zealand. They posed zero threat to New Zealand's safety. So why go? Because history and emotional ties still mattered. You see this in other moments too. Remember when Argentina and Britain had that Falklands conflict? At first, Argentina thought, hey, we're tight with the UA! America will mediate for us. And the US did step in at first, saying, guys, calm down. Let's not fight. But once the shooting started, guess who America backed? They lent their warships to Britain and handed over military intel. Why? Because family's family. 200 years ago, we were one nation, Argentina, who even knows you. That's why, even today, the Commonwealth isn't just some meaningless relic. Sure, the British Empire has shrunk down to just the British Isles, with a few scattered islands in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. These territories have no real economic or territorial importance. But the idea of the Commonwealth still holds power. Why? Because the Brits figured out a clever system 200 years ago. We've spent a lot of time singing the praises of the British Empire, haven't we? It's like a kid who got burned, learned the lesson, and got smart. After losing America, the British realized we can't rule colonies with violence and control. We need to let them grow naturally, let them flourish like an ecosystem. A loose, flexible system of trade and emotional ties will be far more beneficial. Bach, and boy, did that work. After America's independence, the British Empire rebuilt itself. Over the next century, they created the legendary empire on which the sun never sets. At its peak, it was unmatched. But nations are like people, aren't they? They can be wise for a while and then, poof, they get stupid. Why? Because when the stakes get too high, logic starts to slip. When you're asked to give up too much, it hurts. And the British Empire's greatest crisis came in the 20th century with a problem everyone knows: India. You see, you can compare India to America. America, as we discussed, contributed peanuts, just £100,000 a year in taxes. For Britain, it was small change, easy to walk away from. You just needed someone like Adam Smith to say, do the math. It's not worth it. But India, that was a whole different beast. According to historians, at its peak, India's economic output accounted for 40% of the British Empire's GDP. 40%. Can you imagine? That's not just cutting off an arm, that's cutting out a lung. Britain simply couldn't wrap its head around the idea of letting India go. The loss was just too big to stomach. If you look at a map of the British Empire at its peak, you'll notice something interesting. The colonies are everywhere, but here's the pattern: they all revolve around India. Take East Africa, Southeast Asia, even Britain's attempts to take a peek into Tibet. All of it was about securing trade routes to India. India wasn't just a colony, it was the entire point of the British Empire. The British even had a strategy called the D2XC, Plan, Cairo, and Cape Town. Cairo, of course, was the gateway to the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Suez Canal leading straight into the Indian Ocean. Cape Town, on the other hand, was the route around the Cape of Good Hope via the Atlantic. These two routes were the commercial lifelines of the empire. Los India. The rest of the colonies were pointless, just window dressing. That's why India was famously called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. If India were to gain independence, the rest of the empire could crumble like a house of cards. And that day did come, but it didn't happen overnight. At first, the British didn't even see it coming. The turning point, 1919 World War I, had just ended, and the British thought their rule in India was rock solid. But that year, something happened that lit a fire no one could put out: the Amritsar massacre. Now, let's be clear: if you compare the scale of this massacre to the atrocities committed elsewhere in history, like what the Japanese did in China, it's not even close. But here's the thing, the British Empire wasn't supposed to operate like that. In a system built on British ethics and moral superiority, the massacre was unforgivable. Here's what happened. A British general ordered troops to open fire on a peaceful gathering of protesters, killing hundreds on the spot. And while the numbers might not seem huge, in the grand scope of history, the symbolism was seismic. This wasn't just violence, it was violence unleashed on one of the world's most famously peaceful populations, and it spread like wildfire. The Amritsar massacre became the match that lit India's nationalist movement. Ironically, the British had already done all the prep work for their own downfall. Who was leading the charge? Gandhi and others like him. And where were they trained? In Britain, Gandhi was educated in British culture, British law, British institutions. The empire had created the very people who would dismantle it. The massacre gave Gandhi's nonviolent resistance movement and Indian nationalism in general the fuel it needed. Now, I know Gandhi's story deserves its own episode, and we'll definitely get to that one day. For now, just remember this: Gandhi and his followers, whether they pursued violence or nonviolence, channeled the anger and humiliation into a full blown movement against British rule. So, what did Britain do? Well, they panicked. And their reaction was straight out of the American Revolutionary War playbook: repression, because the stakes were just too high to let India go. Remember, India accounted for a whopping 40% of the British Empire's GDP. Losing it would be like ripping out the empire's spine. So they tried to suppress the resistance, and sometimes that suppression turned downright brutal. Take one of the most infuriating incidents. A British missionary was riding his bicycle down a street when he was attacked by Indian nationalists. Now, you'd think the British would handle it like any other crime: arrest the perpetrators, put them on trial, done. But no, the British decided to humiliate the entire local population. The governor ordered that any Indian who passed through that street had to crawl on their hands and knees. Can you imagine? In a moment when nationalist sentiment was already at a boiling point, this was like pouring gasoline on a bonfire. So, there you have it: repression leads to resistance. The British tried to tighten their grip, and India pushed back harder. You humiliate, they organize. You whip, they rally. And with leaders like Gandhi channeling that rage into a unified cause, the British were facing a storm they couldn't contain. It was only a matter of time. Now, as if the British Empire didn't have enough on its plate, along came its final disaster: Hitler. When Hitler made it clear he was gearing up for World War II, India was already knocking on the door of independence. Here's how it went down. Britain told India, "Look, help us win this war, and once we're victorious, you'll get your independence." Deal. And the Indians, ever the pragmatic negotiators, agreed. Fine, we'll wait for that day. That day came quickly enough. By 1945, Germany surrendered. On August 15th, Japan's emperor announced his surrender. That day became Victory Day. And all across India, people were waiting, practically holding their breath. Okay, we held up our end of the bargain. Now give us our independence, hand over that ticket to freedom. But here's the thing: by 1945, India wasn't the same. The nationalist fire that had started with events like the Amritsar massacre had grown, and now it had splintered. What splintered it? And nationalism within nationalism. While the Indian National Congress, led by Gandhi and Nehru, still pushed for an independent, unified India. Another force had emerged, Muslim nationalism, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, it's not for us to sit here decades later and decide who was right or wrong, but once nationalism mixes with religion, things get messy. Rational conversation becomes impossible. And Jinnah, his position was especially inflexible because, unknown to most, he was terminally ill. Jinnah knew his days were numbered, and he desperately wanted to see the creation of Pakistan before he died. That's why his stance was so rigid. There was no time for compromise. His opponents didn't realize this, and negotiations got nowhere fast. Enter Lord Mountbatten, Britain's final viceroy of India. When Mountbatten arrived, he came with a single, clear mission: get Britain out of India peacefully, if possible. The British government had already thrown up its hands. The Prime Minister had told Mountbatten, "You have unprecedented authority. Do what you need to do. Make the decisions. Just get us out of there." And that order reveals a lot. The British had reached a point where they didn't care about holding onto India anymore. They just wanted to leave without bloodshed. Peaceful withdrawal. That was the goal. But here's the problem: you can't cling to something for decades, refuse to let go, and then, at the last moment, hope for a smooth, graceful exit. At the negotiating table, the split became clear. Nehru said, "Let's create a federation. States can have some autonomy, but we remain one unified India." Jinnah shot back, "Not a chance. We need full independence. Pakistan must exist." Nehru, frustrated, finally said, "Fine, let's split. But how do you split a country as vast and complex as India? By religion. Simple on paper, but a nightmare in reality, because India wasn't neatly divided into religious neighborhoods. In Punjab, for example, Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims lived side by side, neighbors, friends, co workers. How do you draw a line between them? How do you say, this village goes to India, that village goes to Pakistan, when sometimes even the people next door practiced different faiths? This chaotic partitioning created problems we still see today. Just look at Kashmir. Why have India and Pakistan been fighting over it for decades? Because the roots of that conflict go back to this very moment. The worst of the tragedy unfolded in the months leading up to August 15, 1947. The British were in a hurry. They wanted out. Mountbatten's deadline was clear: get this done before August the 15th, and the pressure was unbearable. In the end, with no time for proper surveys or negotiations, Mountbatten had no choice but to delegate. He sent a British lawyer, an outsider who knew nothing about the local dynamics, to draw the border. This guy wasn't malicious, but the clock was ticking. He looked at the map, drew a rough line, and said, "Okay, this side goes to India, that side goes to Pakistan." And just like that, two nations were born. The border was arbitrary, rushed, and utterly disconnected from the realities on the ground. Villages, families, and entire communities were ripped apart overnight. The result: pure chaos. Now just imagine the religious and ethnic tensions in India had already reached a boiling point where even the smallest spark could ignite an inferno. And then, boom, on August 15th, 1947, the line was drawn. This side is India, that side is Pakistan. The result: chaos. In just 2 months, 10 million people were forced to flee their homes, sparking a migration of unimaginable scale. And where there's a mass exodus, there's always tragedy. Alongside the migration came widespread massacres. If you've ever seen the documentaries on this period, the footage alone will send chills down your spine. Mountbatten, Britain's last viceroy of India, saw the writing on the wall. In May 1947, before the handover, he wrote a letter to the British Prime Minister. I'm leaving. Let the Indians regret it. There will be rivers of blood. And he wasn't wrong. Decades later, India and Pakistan still carry the scars of that partition. The pain, the trauma, and the political fissures remain as deep and unhealed as ever. So, why did it all happen? Because the British Empire had spent too long clinging to control. Obsessed with domination, reluctant to grant independence, and unable to act with the wisdom they themselves had discovered as far back as Adam Smith's time. Smith had laid it all out. You don't need to control, you just need to trade. But the British ignored that lesson and they paid the price. The partition of India stands as one of history's great tragedies, and let's be honest, the British bear responsibility for that. It was their failure, decades of stubborn refusal to let go, that set the stage for such devastation. But here's where history gets ironic. By the 1960s and 70s, when African nations began demanding independence, the British finally wised up. They'd learned their lesson. This time, their math was simple. Why wait for the nationalists to overthrow us violently? The elites leading these movements were educated in Britain anyway. There are people. Let's hand power to them peacefully, pack our bags, and keep doing business with their governments. And that's exactly what happened. The British exited Africa with surprising calm. No grand battles, no bloodshed, just a quiet, pragmatic retreat. You could call it an elegant euthanasia for the British Empire. So, what's the lesson here? Over hundreds of years, the British Empire's journey boils down to one question: is control really such a good thing? Think about it into today's AI driven world. We're seeing the collapse of traditional, rigid industrial structures. Those old school systems built on hierarchy and centralization are being replaced by dynamic, decentralized networks. Every individual, every device, even every piece of data can now connect to society in real time thanks to AI creating a fluid, adaptive system of collaboration and innovation. In the past, management was all about control and certainty. Worried employees wouldn't show up on time. Introduce punch cards to guarantee working hours. Afraid performance would slip. Roll out KPIs to make results measurable. Concerned about team morale. Use company culture and team building exercises to stabilize people's spirits. But in the AI era, all of these tools are useless. Today's world isn't linear or static, it's dynamic, open, and in constant flux. Markets change, technology evolves, individual behaviors shift. Everything is driven by real time data. Trying to enforce certainty in this environment is like trying to nail jelly to a wall. In the AI age, management isn't about control, it's about empowerment and adaptation. Managers must rely on algorithms and data driven insights to make real time decisions. They need to maintain flexible connections with individuals and teams through AI tools, allowing systems to self adapt, collaborate, and innovate despite all the uncertainty. Let's face it, for managers, especially those dealing with Gen Z employees, the old school approach just doesn't work anymore. You can't lecture them into loyalty. You can't. I control their hearts. And while I wish I had some silver bullet solution for all the managers out there. I don't. I won't pretend to have all the answers. All I can offer are metaphors and some borrowed wisdom from Western classical literature. Because, honestly, sometimes to move forward, we need to stop looking for control and start looking for understanding. Let's take a step back and look at how Western literature reflects the evolution of organizational structures. Two classics, Pride and Prejudice and War and Peace, show us the traditional industrial society in vivid detail. In Pride and Prejudice, the organizational structure mirrors the family power dynamics of the time, a strict top down pyramid led by the elders. Take Mrs. Bennet, for example. She's the CEO of the household, pulling every string to secure her family's future. Everything is about control. Resources, influence, and status all flow through the people at the top, while those at the bottom, like daughters hoping to marry up, must depend on alliances, relationships, and sometimes manipulation. This system looks stable on the surface, but beneath it, it's shaky and full of tension. The moment the central pillar collapses, boom, the whole structure comes crashing down. Now shift to war and peace. This one highlights horizontal relationships where different families and factions are engaged in a relentless zero sum game. Everyone's a temporary ally pretending to be brothers while secretly plotting against one another. The Bolkowskis, the Kurgans, these families seem close. But the second there's a dispute over land, money, or influence, the alliances shatter. This is traditional industrial society, rigid hierarchies on one hand, bitter infighting on the other. A Pride and Prejudice plus War and Peace equals an organization held together by control, resources, and competition. But wait, Western literature also offers us two stories that point the way toward modern, flexible teams. Teams that are far better suited for the AI era. Enter Don Quixote and Robinson Crusoe. Don Quixote perfectly represents the small, scrappy startup. You've got a team of two Don Quixote, a visionary obsessed with saving the world, and Sancho Panza, the pragmatic sidekick who gets things done. There's no formal management structure, no KPAs, no strategy meetings. They don't even know what a business process is. But they have one thing that keeps them going, a shared goal. Don Quixote's clarity of purpose, no matter how absurd, keeps the team focused. And their trust in each other, despite their quirks and flaws, allows them to move forward. Then there's Robinson Crusoe, the ultimate example of a resilient, flexible organization. Robinson's team with Friday isn't based on hierarchy or control. There's no punching in at 9 a.m., no fixed job descriptions. Instead, their collaboration is built on trust and ability. Robinson respects Friday's skills and autonomy, and together they create a small, efficient survival system. This isn't about power, it's about partnership. Robinson doesn't force tasks on Friday. He simply says, "Who wants to help me explore, build a shelter, hunt for food?" And the team organizes itself naturally. This freedom fosters initiative and creativity, leading to high execution and unshakable cohesion. So, what can we learn here? Traditional industrial structures are rigid and fragile, pride and prejudice on the inside, and war and peace on the outside. But modern teams, inspired by Don Quixote and Robinson Crusoe, are flexible, collaborative, and dynamic. They operate on shared goals, trust, and adaptability, not control. Now, let's circle back to the British Empire. What kept the empire alive for so long wasn't sheer control, but a sense of symbiosis. The colonies didn't always feel dominated. In many cases, there were trust, trade, and emotional connections. Collaboration through business and shared purpose created a system that worked for both sides. Isn't that a much healthier approach than brute force control? Uh, but here's the challenge. How do we move from a Pride and Prejudice style organization to a Robinson Crusoe or Don Quixote style team? I don't have a definitive answer. That transformation depends on each team's unique circumstances. In traditional industrial society, the goal was to eliminate uncertainty by chasing certainty. In the AI era, we need to rethink that mindset. Instead of fighting uncertainty, we should embrace it, turning unpredictability into an opportunity for innovation and growth. At Deep Story, we're taking our own steps in this direction. In our team and membership system, we're experimenting not with grand, sweeping reforms, but with small, cautious adjustments. Think of it as evolution, not revolution. We're feeling our way forward bit by bit, with open minds and a willingness to adapt. Will we succeed? I don't know yet, but I believe that eventually we'll find our way to a Robinson Crusoe or Don Quixote inspired team, one that thrives on trust, flexibility, and a shared vision. And when we do, we'll have something exciting to share with all of you.